Check that you have all your panels, front facing, back facing, and sleeve, skirt panels, facing, modesty panel, and pocket. Sew up all your darts on your top as well as your skirt. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitch on the front panel. Take your back panel and your front panels. With the right sides together, we're going to see how much to pull to reduce the length of the shoulder of the front. Sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the seam, push it towards the back and do a top stitch at about 0.8 cm seam allowance. Locate the notch for where the pocket will start. Position the pocket and sew it with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Push the pocket out and understitch on the pocket, approximately 0.3 cm from the seam. Sew the top to the skirt at a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitch on the crown of the sleeve. Sew the sleeve to the armhole with about 1 cm seam allowance. Matching up the side seams and the notches first. To match the sleeve to the armhole, pull gently onto your gathering stitch to reduce the length of the sleeve. Notice that I'm focusing all the gathers at the shoulder seam. This will create a more dramatic look. Sew it together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the seam, and with right sides together, sew the side seam from here all the way around the pocket to the bottom, and repeat on the other side. I repeat right sides together. For the sleeve, measure and fold up 1.5 cm seam allowance and sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. the facing, join the top and bottom facing together with right sides at 1 cm seam allowance. Join the back and the front facing together at the shoulders with a 1 cm seam allowance. Do notice that the facing looks like a Y shape. For the modesty panel, make sure there is interfacing on one side, 1/2. Fold it into half lengthwise and sew on the short edge 1 cm. Turn it inside out. Press and iron flat. Baste the edges together close to the edge. With all the raw edges facing the same direction, put your modesty panel along the notch and sew down with a 1 cm seam allowance. Now for the left side, you're going to sew your button loops. Mark and follow the placement from the paper pattern. I've decided to use an elastic band so that's easier for me to remove and put my button in. I'll be demonstrating on the right side, but please go ahead and do this on the left side. Using the marking from the paper pattern, I'll take one end of the elastic. Make a loop suitable for the size of your button. Make sure the loop is pointing inwards towards the dress. Start with one side of the elastic and sew along the vertical line down multiple times to make sure it's secure. U-turn the elastic so it forms a little loop. And again sew along the vertical line on both elastics. Grab your facing and align it to the neckline. Sew it together with a 1 cm seam allowance. At the corner, to prevent it from being too bulky and thick, we're going to trim away the seam allowance. Trim into the seam allowances, especially where it's curved, to remove any tension. Spread open the facing, push all the seam allowances towards the facing and sew an understitch on the facing. Sew close to the seam. Follow the corresponding markings on the right hand side and hand sew down your buttons. Overlock the bottom edge and then measure and mark 5 centimeters. Fold it up, iron and sew with a 4 centimeter seam allowance. Your dress is completed!